had an exhibit on this in 2018. A lot of new information, new discoveries have been coming up. And so this exhibit will be exploring that. And we will get Dr. Debbie Bolter will be one of the speakers next spring. So if you're interested in early human hominids, this could be a great talk. And we will be having a grand opening right after that first talk of the exhibit. So that's something I'm personally excited about because I'm involved in putting this exhibit together. And then finally, right now the salmon are coming up the river. And through their fall flying. And how many of you have ever been to Night Ferry? Great. So it's a great opportunity to see the salmon. They're coming up and they're spawning, and then of course they die. But the Salmon Festival celebrates this free, family friendly, and that Night Ferry. And usually this time of the year, it's a beautiful day and the river's clear. You can really see the salmon, but it's lots of time. And for those of you, many faculty that are here, if you're here to get your box hours, you got your QR code here. And for those of you students who need some kind of proof that you were here, I suggest you quietly take pictures 3 or 4 times during the program as proof that you have been here for your professor. So, okay, so now let's see. How is that? Okay, so when you want to get your slideshow back up, and I will introduce you. Okay, and let's begin from the beginning. Okay, so when we're here, so that we can get you both of it on the camera. Okay, yeah, we have to stand close together so that Bobby can record us. Okay, so it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Andrew Hay. He's a professional anthropologist.
Oh, just Mr.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. My mistake. He is a professional anthropologist and lecturer here in the San Joaquin Valley, California. And after beginning his MJC, his educational journey right here in MJC, totally live, by the way. He fell in love with social sciences, studying anthropology and archaeology at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. In later times, he specialized in the anthropology of religion, past and present, studying Christianity and Islam for 2 years at a multi-denominational seminary in Berkeley, and eventually earning an MA in anthropology from CSU, East Bay, and Hayward. He also takes interest in the blended field of ethnohistory, the application of the social sciences to understanding the historical situation of indigenous peoples. He has written on the historical relationship between ethnicity, religion, and ecology in the U.S. and beyond. He has been teaching here at MJC since 2012, teaching cultural and linguistic anthropology. It's beloved alma mater, mine too, and it's a subject area liaison for the MJC's Guided Pathways Initiative. In all of his pursuits, he enjoys pushing the conversation forward on faith, symbolism, culture, and pride of place. And so I will now hand it over to Andrew.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and it's good to meet all of you. I am going to be talking about one of those subjects that is not actually, as you may have noticed from the summary there, religion, ecology, language, symbolism. Where does medical anthropology fit in? Right? Well, you discover some things when you are a professor that you didn't know were going to be important to you when you were a student. And one thing I realized right away when I started teaching at MJC was that an awful lot of my students that were in my classes, especially our introductory class, Anthropology 102, Cultural Anthropology, were medical students. They were going into nursing, they were otherwise going into medical programs, and I thought, suddenly all the times in my head that my professors had gone on about the importance of medical anthropology and the intersection of culture, society, and illness. It was like that moment in the crime procedural where the person thinks through all of the evidence. Oh yeah, they kept telling me this was going to be important. So I dug out all of my notes and started trying to adapt that class to be a better exploration of medicine and science. And I'm so glad I did because, wouldn't you know it, we had a major global pandemic. Some of you may remember, these last few years. And I suddenly felt really good about myself that I'd been teaching the basics of social epidemiology for a couple of years to, who knows how many students. That's our most popular class. But I don't know if that's true or if it's physical anthropology. Hopefully I'm not stepping on my colleagues' toes. But, I was so happy suddenly that I'd sent all this information out into the world. It is a privilege sometimes to know that, like, you were the person that told someone about something. And when I was approached to do a series for the Science Colloquium, then I thought, well, we should talk about social epidemiology. And if you don't know what that is yet, that's okay. That's what I'm talking about for the next hour, right? So basically what we're going to do here, I'm going to introduce my field, anthropology, for those of you who might not be super familiar with it. I'll try and be quick because I know a lot of you are actually anthropology students, and that's why you've been bribed to be here. But I'll do my little 5-minute introduction to the field. I'll talk about what medical anthropology is. I'll talk about where it intersects with social epidemiology, which is the main topic for today. And we'll start going down the list of questions, basically. If you're a social epidemiologist or just a medical anthropologist looking at disease in society, well, what are the intersections between culture, society, and illness? So I'll be walking us through a couple of the basic ideas. I'll try to, respect your time and leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So first of all, what is anthropology? I do find that most people that I talk to have at least heard of it, or maybe they've heard of its subdiscipline, archaeology. But I think a lot of people do have a kind of a fuzzy definition in their head. So just to clarify, anthropology is the study of the human species, right? And really the study of humanity as a species, and everything that is relevant to the human experience is theoretically within our purview. It's generally thought that anthropology got its start really, certainly when it was named, was in the 1860s. A lot of you may be familiar with the book Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. Opened a lot of people's eyes to the idea that, hey, wait a minute, if all living kind of breathing things with organs, etc., have an evolutionary history, well, humans must too, right? And although Darwin was careful to sort of avoid really making that implication strongly in that text, he then wrote a sequel, which blew the whole thing open. Anthropology really came out of the burst of curiosity about human evolution that followed the publication of this, to some extent, The Origin of the Species, and especially the second book, The Descent of Man. Anthropology picked up, however, many more areas as it went along. If you were going to understand the past, that had implications for the present. If you were training up a bunch of individuals to know how to excavate physical remains like a paleontologist would, That was going to have relevance to some other things too, like the antiquarianism, call it grave robbing, that a lot of upper crust individuals in the 19th century were engaged in, had the potential to become a science if a scientific and systematic approach was adopted. So some people, archaeologists, started thinking of themselves as being a kind of a subdiscipline of anthropology. So did people who were curious about culture and society in the present. And you had the development of people studying presently living populations, right? Our culture, our society, etc. That's sociocultural anthropology, and that's my concentration. And finally, you cannot study human beings without running into the issue of language. One of the things that makes our species distinct is the very unique way that it employs language and symbolism. So over time, anthropology has expanded in scope. It's sometimes called we call it the most holistic of the social sciences, just because we tend to keep our fingers in a lot of pies. It always has been a field that draws on the widest possible kind of sets of information about the human species. And even someone like me, who's mostly studying the present, is going to reach back into that archaeology and paleoanthropology side of things from time to time to answer some key questions, like, where do all of these bacteria and viruses that seem sort of adapted to us and sort of not, where did they come from, right? Sometimes those of us who are looking at issues in the present are going to draw on information from the past. Those of us that are looking at the past draw on contemporary studies, because how else do you learn how social and cultural processes affect things, right? It's kind of a funny field then. It's a grab bag. We study a lot of very different topics, trying to throw them all back together into maybe our core motivating question of what it means to be a human being. Is a lot of work. We do think, however, that there is value in at least someone stepping back and trying to analyze all of the data at once. If you wanted to be less charitable, you might say jack of all trades, master of none. Fair, right? But we have had our contributions over the years. If you are thinking like an anthropologist, that usually means taking that broad view whenever possible. We heavily emphasize field study, as opposed to, say, laboratory research or experimentation. A lot of the things that we study are broad-scale social processes that, can't be put in a lab, or you have paleoanthropology and archaeologists need to go to the field to find the bones that they study, right? In my area, social cultural anthropology, part of the reason for the emphasis on studying things in the field, which for us means going and researching with and in the communities that we study, is that you can't trust what people say about culture. Second-hand, third-hand information about someone else's way of life is very untrustworthy. So we tend to emphasize field study. We tend to emphasize cross-cultural comparison. We like to look at what is known about the various societies and cultures of the world, past and present, and find the similarities and differences. And we tend to employ what we call a relativistic view on culture. Basically, the idea is that your culture is the context in which you were raised. It gives you a certain set of biases, a certain set of knowledge about the world, whenever possible. If we're engaging in theory, if we're engaging in analysis, we try to do so from people's own perspectives on their own culture and society. At least that's got to be our starting point. The feeling is that if you come up with an explanation for human behavior or the trajectory of a culture that makes sense to you, but would not make sense to someone who is actually a member of that culture, you may have missed something, right? So we highly value that relativism. I like this quote from Nancy Banks Smith: "Anthropology is the science which tells us that people are the same the world over, except when they're different." And I think this is something that anthropologists, regardless of their concentration, have often found to be true. It is equally remarkable how different and how diverse and how interesting all of our differences are. at the same time, the core experiences of a human being do not change that much, nor have. It's easy to think about past cultures as though they were completely different from our own. And yet, our brains have been anatomically modern human brains for 100,000 years, right? And if you were just talking to someone that you found at any point in the world, at any point in time, you'd find yourself having familiar conversations about family, about faith, about survival, about what we're worried about the next season over, right? There is a universality to the human experience despite our diversities, and we like to try and get to that point. Now, medical anthropology is an interesting one. We have tended to divide the field into those 4 areas that I mentioned earlier. Biological anthropology, mostly looking at human evolution, the physical aspects, the physical results of that, like our genetic profiles, that kind of thing. Archaeology, which studies past cultures based on the evidence of the material remains. Cultural or sociocultural anthropology, studying living cultures and the way they work. And linguistic anthropology, looking at the social implications of language. This is, generally speaking, it's how we're all taught about, like what anthropology is, if you're learning in the US anyway, right? It's this 4-field approach. But this talk is about medical anthropology. Which of these fields is it? And if I ask my students, they often make a guess in the general direction of either biological, thinking, well, medicine is the study of bodies, kind of. Bodies are physical things, right? They're biological things. Maybe this is a subfield of biological anthropology, to which I say it can be. Other people will reason, this must be a subset of cultural anthropology if you're talking about how healthcare things happen, right? How epidemic diseases spread or don't spread, or what happens when doctors try to intervene. Well, that sounds like a cultural topic to address, to which I say, it can be. Medical anthropology, the application of anthropological thought to the practice of medicine, doesn't really sit neatly within one of these 4 fields. It borrows from all of them, and some people think it should be considered just a 5th field within maybe a 5-field approach to things. Obviously, my own background, my own experiences are going to influence how I'm going to present the issue. So you're going to get a bunch of cultural stuff, right? But you could come at medical anthropology from any number of directions, as long as you are looking at the issue of medicine, but you're looking at it from an intentionally cross-cultural perspective, an anthropological perspective, then you're probably a medical anthropologist. Denise asked me to talk about my educational journey, which I'm happy to do. So if you'll indulge me for just another second, I thought I would mention about how I ended up being an anthropologist in the first place. And in order to do that, I'm really going to talk up Modesto Junior College. I love this place with every fiber of my being. I'm so happy that when I got through all of it, that I had the opportunity to come and teach here as a professor, because I was a student at MJC too. Years ago, yeah. I was a high school dropout, 16 years old, not really, on the grand scheme of things, a person with a lot of prospects. Very smart. People always told me, you've got potential. And I did, right? But you can have all the potential in the world and not end up in the career that you want, right? And you can, find yourself on a career for which you have no aptitude either. Hopefully that didn't happen to me. But I will say this for MJC. It is a place that gives you second chances. It is a place that if you need it, gives you third chances, fourth chances, fifth chances. If you keep coming back for more, we'll give you some more chances, right? Because we really, really do believe that everybody has the potential to do whatever is going to make them happy and help out the world, and whatever your goals in your career are. There is no ceiling. And if I went from being a 16-year-old high school dropout to a tenured professor of anthropology in just 20 years, MJC is an enormous reason why that happened. That said, when you are beginning college unexpectedly early, a lot of people ask you this question over and over: what's your major? And you better have something kind of ready. This is quite stressful if you don't have something in mind. But my dad is a geologist. Some of you might know him, actually. Gary Hayes teaches just upstairs there. Right? And credit to my parents as well, by the way. They talked me into not just dropping out, but actually getting a California Certificate of High School Proficiency equivalency exam first. But MJC pretty much takes you if you're breathing anyway. Right. But I needed to have a major, right? And I thought back to all of the family travel that we'd done over the years. If your dad is a geologist, you end up seeing a lot of the country before the age of 10 or whatever. And I thought about what made me the happiest or the most excited. And let me tell you, that was exploring ancient ruins. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be Indiana Jones. I'm gonna declare a major in archaeology. So it turns out you can't major in archaeology. It's not an independent discipline. It's under this hat of anthropology, right? So I'm like, all right, I'll play your game, academic system, right? I'll take some other classes, whatever you say, right? And it's going to push me along in the direction of my career, my exciting career as an archaeologist. So it turns out I like a lot of things about studying human beings. I just had never heard of cultural anthropology before, right? It just wasn't even on my radar. When I started taking classes across a broad range of anthropological fields, and some people in this room may remember Dawn and Roberta Linkett, just a power duo that used to teach here at MJC. Oh, I start taking all their classes and pestering Don in his office hours. And they're probably starting to think, this person's going to be back, aren't they? Right? I realize I enjoy pretty much all aspects of the field. And the more I studied, and I went all the way out to Colorado, where I thought the interesting archaeology was. Turns out, you know, California is no slouch in that regard. But all right, you're 18, you don't know, right? I go out. I'm working on sites. One thing that happens if you are working a modern archaeological site is that you meet a lot of tribal consultants, people who are, you know, their business is basically safeguarding ancestral remains and making sure that archaeologists aren't doing anything with them that they shouldn't, which could be adversarial in nature, but can be also really great. The truth is, we've come to heavily rely on our Native American context to help us understand the site. Archaeologists want to treat remains respectfully, for that matter, and for the most part. You know, but I found that I enjoyed those conversations in the present about the past almost as much as I enjoyed studying the past. And it began my slow slide towards specializing in modern cultural anthropology, especially religious issues, which have always been especially fascinating to me. And by the time I was pursuing a master's program, I'd made the switch entirely over to studying contemporary society. I'll always love archaeology, I do. I love a good discussion of it. But I've dedicated most of my career to helping people understand each other, and I find it to be very gratifying work. So that's how you become an anthropologist. Now, if you want to become a medical anthropologist, you might need to get a medical degree as well. So word of warning there. No small matter, studying the intersection of society, culture, and health. Or maybe to think about it another way, society, culture, and illness. Because Of course, a lot of our concerns are about what happens when people get sick. Even compared to the already relatively young field of anthropology, medical anthropology is even more of a newborn. It really wasn't until the late 1970s that there started to be a concerted effort to study medical anthropology. And medical anthropology can also refer to a couple of different things. Essentially, if it is an application of the theories and the methodology of anthropology to medicine, it's medical anthropology, like the hints in the name, right? There are a couple of things that mark the way that medical anthropologists tend to study public health issues. One of those major things is the ethnographic method of study. That is the bread and butter of the cultural anthropologist. It means if you're an ethnographer, if you are engaging in ethnographic study, it means, I said we like field studies, right? We study things in person. If you're going to be studying a social or a cultural phenomenon as an anthropologist, you're going to be doing it in place with the people, with the community that you're studying, with their awareness and consent, right? You're going to develop knowledge with them, right? And we rely very, very heavily on this in anthropology whenever we're talking about the present. So cultural anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, we do all of our field study in person. This is one of the major things that we've contributed to the study of medicine, is going to locations where public health events or are occurring, or there are situations involving clinical care, right? We're going to be in that clinic looking at how people interact. Doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, they are very well intentioned, and they are really overworked. And it can be very difficult, if you are that doctor or that nurse, to find the time to do anything, let alone a 2-year long-term study of how care is being delivered in that clinical environment, right? Anthropologists, though, do see some value, as always, in stepping back, taking a slightly broader view. We take the theories and information that we have uncovered over this century of ethnographic study as well. We know that people have very different ideas about health from culture to culture. They have very different ideas about their body from culture to culture. They have varying degrees of knowledge about health and healing, whether that is their knowledge of the medical system, whether that is their knowledge of their own traditional indigenous practices of medicine, which all cultures have. Sometimes my students are surprised to learn that, because they've been taught that medicine is a production of Western culture, that at some point, right, probably Hippocrates, we'll see him on the next slide, right? At some point, Western medicine began, and for the first time, human beings had a way to respond when they were sick. Well, no, actually, all human beings get sick. It is characteristic of our species, and like every species, right? And every culture that has ever existed has built up something of a body of knowledge and information about medicine. Indeed, if you ask where all of these medicines and practices actually come from, it's not really correct to refer to Western medicine as Western medicine. The information, the knowledge, the practices that have come into it are a global production. And although the Western hospital and clinical system is second to none, much of the knowledge, the specific pharmaceutical drugs, a lot of these things have come from observations of how people treat stuff out there in the world. If a drug company is looking for instance, a new cure for this disease, they start asking, well, what do people use, right? And they try to isolate the compounds that make an aspirin instead of just a leaf of willow bark, right? And then they find a way to turn that into a deliverable healthcare product. Right? So a medical anthropologist is going to be coming to conversations about public health, maybe from a different direction, because it's going to be drawing on this rich ethnographic library of knowledge about how people from around the world respond to questions of health. And this can be especially important in looking at how patients and doctors interact. If you are going into medicine, I hope you've realized by now that your patients won't all be from the exact same cultural background. Right? They're going to be coming from a lot of different places. They're going to be having a lot of different ideas running around in their head about what the body is, what it looks like when it's healthy, what it looks like when it isn't. If there's diseases, what diseases are there? They have their own knowledge that comes down to them. It's quite likely, if they're a normal patient, that they will be trying the medical practices of quite a few different cultures at once. And that can be a problem if you don't know what's going on. It can be a problem if you don't know why. And it can be especially a problem if you have struggled to build rapport with that patient, a relationship of trust in both directions. And that can really only proceed from understanding. So medical anthropologists began especially by looking at those clinical exchanges. They became experts in what we call transcultural medical care. That just means that a person from one culture is trying to receive care in a multicultural environment, right? Probably their doctors and nurses are coming at things from something of a different direction than they are. How do patients and carers meet? How do they find common ground, even across these seemingly vast gulfs of different cultures? I thought I might say a word in the direction of Paul Farmer. We lost him in February of last year, and the world's still reeling because of it. He was one of the first medical anthropologists, and I think he's a good example of medical anthropologists too. He is a person who had both a medical doctorate, right, and a PhD in anthropology. He was kind of made his mark pretty early on. While his dissertation basically was a major event kind of in the history of medical anthropology. He wrote a book called Your brain ever blitz right when you're doing a public talk? Let's see here. Well, anyways, his dissertation was about AIDS. AIDS, particularly in the nation of Haiti, where he worked for most of his career. And AIDS is problematic for a number of reasons. It was a medical mystery when it first started, that epidemic. They really didn't know even the class of thing that it was. We nowadays talk about retroviruses and have a much clearer idea of what they were. But they had no idea in the early AIDS crisis. And one thing a medical anthropologist will tell you is that when you have a scientific mystery, culture and society do not wait to fill in the gaps with stories that explain why people are getting sick and dying. A major problem about AIDS was stigma. People were terrified of it. They believed a lot of things about its transmission that did not match what medical data suggested. The idea of who got AIDS was fundamentally flawed, just simply as a result of where that epidemic began. It was first identified in the mostly LGBTQ community of the West Coast. Because of that, both with doctors initially, but also very much so with the public, it became associated with homosexuality. And that impression persisted long after it was actually true. By the time Farmer was writing in the late 80s, the #1 most common way for that disease to be passed down was mother to child at the time of birth. That was a major problem in Haiti. But what he discovered was that people would, because of the great stigma of HIV, they would hide their symptoms. They would not seek treatment, right, because of fear of accusation. then too, you've got some other problems. He's studying in Haiti, is famously one of the poorest nations in the world. Even if someone tries to seek out medical care in Haiti at that time, are they going to be able to find it? And with his anthropologist brain, he's thinking, well, whether or not there's a hospital here is not just a question of chance. We build hospitals and clinics in certain locations. We develop cures for things for certain, mostly economic motivations. We can't just assume that healthcare will be reaching the people who need it most without intentionally producing the social circumstances that will lead to a hospital being here, for a cure even existing, right? And he starts a conversation about the socio-political dimensions of healthcare. At that time, not the most popular position to be taking. Looking at things systematically and structurally, et cetera, is not really where the medical field was at. But over the ensuing decades, in large part because of the organization he founded, Partners in Health, they were able to demonstrate just how many lives they were saving just by rethinking the context of medical care. And if you'd like to know more about Paul Farmer, consider watching a really excellent documentary that came out on Netflix just after his passing, Bending the Arc, which is a biography both of him and in general about the start of the Partners in Health organization. Real fantastic watch. So I just wanted to say something about Dr. Farmer before moving on. So if you are a medical anthropologist, what kinds of things do you study? There are a couple of really common applications of anthropological theory. One of those things is dragging more into the physical or biological side, right? That's study of human evolution. One of the things that you learn when you're studying very ancient remains is that the connection between disease and humanity is not a new one. We've always had diseases and fallen prey to illnesses. And they affect us right down to our DNA. I don't know this, but if you know this, but certain viruses will modify your DNA permanently. They'll leave evidence behind. There's a whole little subdiscipline of people, they're called paleovirologists, who look for fossil evidence, but also genetic evidence of past pandemics and plagues. And these can greatly impact present health situations. So in general, there's an interest in looking at the relationship between humans and other organisms. Also important here are there animals from which we can contract illnesses, which are many, and for reasons we're about to get into. In fact, some of those animal-borne or zoonotic diseases are among the most dangerous to us. We also excel, as I said, in using the ethnographic method to study clinic environments directly. We like to learn, how do people see the body? How do they see illness? How do they think about preventing illness? Because health begins with prevention, right? But different cultures have different ideas about how to stay healthy, right? And of course, healing, with a special emphasis on the sites where medical care is delivered, your hospitals, your clinics, well, wherever else might be. Both of these areas have contributed to a more nuanced understanding of something we call social epidemiology. Not all social epidemiologists are medical anthropologists, but almost all medical anthropologists have something to say on social epidemiology, which is the study of the role that society and culture play in contributing to the origin, the spread, and the response to epidemic outbreaks of disease. As I said, this is actually not an anthropology thing necessarily, and in fact, social epidemiology is much, much older than anthropology. Its roots go way back to the ancient world. That's why it has a funny Greek name. We have one of the first writers on medicine, on any topic in medicine, the ancient Greek physician named Hippocrates, after whom the Hippocratic Oath has been named. If you're ringing a faint bell or whatever, that might be one of the reasons why. And one of the things that Hippocrates observed in trying to apply the scientific method to the issue of disease was that there were some diseases which seemed to just sort of live in human populations and tended not to cause giant outbreaks of disease. They were just sort of there. He called those endemos within the people, endemic diseases, we would say in English. Other diseases seemed to come at things from the outside, and people would talk about being punished by the gods because suddenly everyone's getting sick and no one even knows what's causing it or where it's from, right? He called those epidemos, right? The study of what is upon the people. And ever since Hippocrates, there's been at least some interest in diseases, although before the age of microscopy, there wasn't a lot to go on. Right? Diseases were poorly understood. They relied on a lot of cultural models for understanding disease that have since gone extinct. You may not even have heard of the four humors, these quasi-spiritual forces within the body that were supposed to be balanced in order to make a person healthy. It's not really how doctors and nurses think about things anymore, but that was the basis of the entire Greek system of medicine. But more or less, right? With the rise of modern technology, our tools for understanding what diseases actually are, what causes them, and what we can do about them greatly expanded. Fans of the Colloquium series may have heard before of the 1854 Broad Street epidemic. We had a really nice detailed presentation on this last year, year before. In any case, I'll summarize. A lot of people see this incident and the contributions of this physician, Dr. John Snow, as very instrumental to the founding of modern epidemiology. Essentially, there was an outbreak of cholera. And breaking with the traditions of the time, John Snow thought, I'm not looking for a mysterious, unseeable gas. I bet a bacterium is causing this, right? Germ theory was in its infancy at the time. But we did know that there were such things as microorganisms. We'd seen them through microscopy. He's like, it's one of these little bugs, right? And I might not be able to find the bug. They had no real means to do that. But if it was a physical thing, physical things occupy physical space. He can find the source of the outbreak if he really thinks about it. And he creates one of the most famous maps in the history of maps, figuring out where the deaths are actually concentrated. And he traces this entire epidemic down to a single water pump, which makes sense from a modern context because we now know that the bacterium that causes cholera is very often waterborne. It's a fecal contaminant of a water supply. And this kind of came too late, unfortunately, for the Broad Street epidemic. There wasn't, by the time he deduced all of this, the epidemic was already receding on its own. However, he was able to very strongly demonstrate what it was that had happened, which meant London started thinking about its water system. It started thinking they had a very strange kind of semi-public, semi-private, collection of agencies in charge of bringing water in and out of the city. There were a lot of very bad idea practices in terms of water management, like people just dumping their waste into the Thames and then pulling their water out of the very same Thames, right? There were a lot of not very health conscious processes, right? It started a wave of sanitation related projects that greatly reshaped the world and greatly reduced the likelihood of future epidemics. Sometimes in social epidemiology, even when you lose, you win. Because the information you gain from watching one thing play out can still be useful. And in the wake of one of the most disastrous pandemic outbreaks in human history, I think it's important to remember, right, that just because things did not go away as social epidemiologists might have hoped during that pandemic, we are still learning incredibly valuable information about public health responses that will be used in future outbreaks. And there will be future outbreaks. Diseases have not gone extinct. Even this disease has not gone extinct, right? But the knowledge that we get from one of the most well-documented now pandemic outbreaks, the COVID-19, is second to nothing in terms of just how many people were on the ground watching things play out, looking at different public health policies and how they impacted things, right? This will be the basis for the next generation of social epidemiologists to do their work. So I keep saying social epidemiology. That, by the way, is in contrast to physical epidemiology. So a physical epidemiologist is mostly looking at the sheer anatomical facts of infection vectors, right? If you are doing this kind of work of trying to isolate where case zero was and identify the pathogen, right? That's physical epidemiology. Social epidemiology is called that because we're looking for the social factors that lead to epidemic outbreaks. If you think about it, the cholera bacterium is important to understanding the 1854 Broad Street epidemic, but so is understanding something about London. So is something about understanding the privatization of water distribution. So is understanding how people think about sewage and disposal of waste and any number of things that are actually social and cultural elements. So epidemiology divided its efforts early on into those that were mostly looking on the physical vectors and causes of disease, and those that were mostly looking at the social factors that exacerbated, maybe even created, a pandemic out of what was just a virus or a bacterium or a toxin in the environment or whatever it was. The big questions that a medical anthropologist who's interested in social epidemiology might be asking: why do we come into contact with pathogens? Those are things that make you sick, right? How do we come into contact with things in the first place? What is it that makes particular pathogens dangerous? And like, why do they become epidemics instead of just existing on the landscape somewhere? What are the things that lead to our immune systems not being able to handle a disease? And how do pathogens get past medical interventions? And for each stage of those journey, there are social and cultural factors and physical factors, right? But we have applications too of anthropological thinking in answering each of those questions as well. So with my last 10 minutes here, let's just run through these questions a little bit and think about what can impact the path of a disease. Certain things are known to greatly impact the likelihood that you are going to come in contact with a dangerous pathogen. A lot of those are related to our distribution of ourselves on the landscape, what we call our land tenure. Where do people live? How densely do they live? How close are you to your neighbor? To what extent are you using common facilities? Like sharing latrines and that kind of thing. Whenever people are living closely or densely, they're more likely, if they're living closely to their animals, we're going to have a lot of problems. And at the margins of human settlements and the wilderness, you also have some problems, especially if that wilderness ain't exactly a wilderness. You still have some social cultural things to explore maybe. Don't know how many of us are old enough to remember 1975 around here, but there was an outbreak of a disease called Lyme disease that caused no small amount of consternation. People started falling mysteriously ill. The case studies early on were all in Connecticut near the town of Lyme, hence the name. And no one knew what was going on. It was 6 years before they even identified what the bacterium, which I wrote down here because I knew I'd forget, Borrelia burgdorferi. It was 6 years before Borrelia burgdorferi was even imaged, right? So they didn't really know what was going on, but they knew they had a novel virus. And their assumption was that it was a novel virus of relatively recent origin. Viruses evolve very, very quickly. It's not unusual for one to just sort of spring up. So it was a reasonable assumption. Here's the thing, though. Once they identified, actually, I believe it's a bacterium, not a virus. Yeah, sorry. Once they actually identified Borrelia burgdorferi, they found it was not new. It was the farthest thing from new. Recently, we had a bit of a shock on someone thought to do an epidemiological examination of Ötzi the caveman, a 5,000-year-old specimen, a human being that was found trapped in a glacier up in the Italian Alps. And poor Ötzi has been just subjected to so many different kinds of very invasive studies over the years. But they found that Ötzi actually had traces of this very bacterium family in his body. He was probably infected with some version, at least, of Borrelia burgdorferi. Whether it had the same symptoms or whether it was acting the same way in his body, we have no way of knowing, right? But that means this wasn't a novel New England bacterium. It wasn't from New England, and it wasn't new, right? So what had changed? If this thing has been around forever, right? Why the sudden epidemic? And many explanations have been offered, but the one that has gained the most consensus, the most traction, is that the unique cultural history of New England had played a major role. So to summarize a lot of history quickly, Europe settled New England, and in doing so, chopped down most of its forests. Within short order, most of Connecticut was just flat farmland with very few trees and forested environments left. Now, eventually, those soils played out, because it turns out that when you chop down all of the trees, your soils they're going to degrade very quickly. Farming moved out west, and New England was largely allowed to return to a forested state. But those new forests were very different in character, very different ecosystemically, very different in terms of the animals and organisms that lived there than what had gone on before. And well, they were full of ticks. In case you didn't know, Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium, but that bacterium is usually transmitted to us through a vector, usually the black-legged deer tick. The further problem that is happening throughout the 70s in New England is that now those forests are again going through a wave of getting chopped down, this time not for farms, but for housing developments. And that situation is being echoed all across the country. It does not help that we've been experiencing a long period of anthropogenic climate change, of global warming, right? And for reasons that actually aren't that clear, we do seem to see that the ticks propagate a lot more in warm environments, and their range has expanded. So this is a continuing problem for us, that every single season, a lot more, the range of these ticks expands, the number of infections expands. And it's something like 300,000 people a year now infected with Lyme disease. So the way that we live, the way that we lose land, where we put ourselves is a major factor in whether we're going to come into contact with pathogens at all. Also worth considering is that not all pathogens are equal. Certain pathogens are more dangerous than others. And if you're thinking about things critically from a standpoint of like evolutionary theory, what makes an organism survive? It makes no sense whatsoever for a bacteria or a virus to kill their host. If they're parasites, right? If they're trying to live in our body, then they want us to keep living so that we can then keep passing them on to other individuals, right? And most viruses or bacteria indeed have a natural, let's say a natural reservoir, right? An organism or a physical environment that they like to live in. And the most dangerous organisms to us are diseases that we can contract, but for which we are not the reservoir. We are the reservoir for certain diseases, human papillomavirus, for instance, which does not kill most of the people who have it, which is good because nearly half of sexually active adults do, right? But we are the reservoir, so the virus doesn't usually kill us. It can make you, put you at more risk for cancer and some other things, right? But we are the reservoir. What you want to worry about is a virus that lives in another organism, but that you can catch. And we catch a lot of, they call them zoonotic illnesses, animal-borne illnesses, especially from our livestock, because what's going on is that you are placing yourself over and over and over in a physical environment with the animals that you're most at risk from. And a lot of our major killers over the years have been zoonotic illnesses. Most people believe, and there's mounting evidence to suggest that COVID-19 certainly is among those. So too are many of the other major health crises like Ebola that we encounter. So anything that's putting people in close proximity with animals, those people are well served to be careful, not panicked, just conscious of the likelihood of human to animal to human transmission. What about the immune system? That's another one. Sometimes my students are like, what do you mean gets past the immune system? How is that a cultural or a social question? Well, here's the thing. Your immune system is very responsive to your experiences in life, and certain social conditions are much more likely to put your immune condition under strain. If you survive a major illness, that's great for you in the short term, but it may have permanently impaired your body's ability to respond to the next crisis. Our bodies aren't always good at responding to multiple threats at once either. If you are fighting off two very different illnesses, your body might be doing something to fight off one illness that actually exacerbates the symptoms of another. And this is more likely if you're getting infected often. Back to that question of, are you going to come in contact in the first place? Those same factors, density, shared resources, etc. If you're living close to a lot of other people, or you're engaged in an economic activity that's daily putting you in contact with a toxin, anything like that, the likelihood is that people in general are going to end up with depressed immune systems, and a pathogen that might have been dangerous to someone will become very, very dangerous to someone else. Another thing that is true is that when people are traveling long distances or between very different regions, and both of those things are happening a lot in the world these days. We have a lot of mass immigration from place to place, but we also have a general shift from rural and countryside environments to urban environments. So you don't necessarily have to go far for this to be a problem. The thing is that you might be coming from a community that has built up a natural immunity to certain kinds of diseases and disorders. But if you are then traveling and ending up in the environment of people who have not been exposed to those same rigors, you might be quite a danger to them. And the colonization of the New World is, of course, the most brutal example of this. There were a great many diseases that traveled from Europe to North America. And it wasn't just that those diseases were especially dangerous, it's that they were kinds of disorders that simply didn't exist in the New World. Respiratory illnesses, for instance, were quite rare, and there weren't a lot of traditional medical responses to them in the New World when all of these diseases started showing up. And the result were mass casualties and some of the worst epidemics that we have ever seen in human history. And finally, you've got this problem of if someone tries to seek out medical care, are they even going to be able to find it? And frankly, if someone is showing symptoms, will they seek out medical care? That problem that Dr. Farmer pointed out in AAT is something very, very common, actually, that people who get sick don't always seek out medical care if there's a huge social cost to doing so. If seeking out care and being seen to do it is going to make you a pariah to everyone around you, then people will be afraid to be seen seeking medical care in the first place. This was the conclusion of a famous medical anthropological study of Hansen's disease in India. Hansen's disease, aka leprosy, is treatable. It's 100% treatable, but it is also a pandemic disease that was spreading wildly in northern India, still is something of a problem. And a major reason why was that people, when they started showing symptoms, would not seek out care, because doing so was very, very likely to get them thrown out of their family. They'd end up living in one of these colonies where even if they were treated, and in short order, there were all these World Health organizations, trying to do good work in these leper colonies. Even if they were treated, they still couldn't go home because the social stigma about the disease was so extreme, which means they would just keep on living there until they were inevitably infected again. And just because you've been cured doesn't mean you can't be infected again, unfortunately. So we have to think also about the social response. What do people do when they think they might be getting sick? And is there even a cure? We know that there are disparities in what diseases get the money, basically, right? Diseases that are expected to be encountered by wealthy, well-to-do people who can pay for their for these fancy medicines they develop, they get researched really fast. Whereas a lot of diseases, in fact, most diseases, are propagated in mostly poor areas. Unsurprisingly, it's much harder to spur development of new cures and preventatives for diseases that mostly affect the poor. That was a major reason for the Foundation of Partners in Health and many other subsequent organizations that have come around, basically to provide incentives for the development of new cures and treatments to be developed. I'll skip that slide because I think I'm supposed to stop talking already. But those of you who know me knew what was coming on the last slide. I love a good book recommendation. So if you are hoping to learn a little bit more about medical anthropology as a field, there's my very favorite textbook. It is a textbook, but it's a good one. Definitely try Paul Farmer's book, Infections and Inequalities. It's written more for a general audience, so it's a very good overview of his work and what he found. And a recent one, I'm reading it right now, is one of the first really kind of mass studies of COVID-19, all based on ethnographic observations of how this virus was treated in various different nations, countries, and communities. I am finding it to be a remarkable read, so I would recommend it to everyone. And there you go, that's what I've got.